Okay, into Isaiah chapter 14 this morning. A couple of things coming back from chapter 13. One of the things that we saw as we were going through chapter 13 last week is what I like to interpret, at least, as the Lord removing his hand of protection from Judah and Jerusalem. We see in the beginning of chapter 13, basically, the Lord appears to be rallying the forces of Babylon to come in and attack Judah and Jerusalem as an instrument of his judgment against Judah and Jerusalem. And sometimes you get the impression that God is calling these nations around Israel to come in and attack them, and then judges them for attacking them. Judgments against Assyria for their attack against the northern kingdom, even though God appeared to have called Assyria in to be his instrument of judgment. And I think what's happening is, in actuality, the Lord is removing that hand of protection surrounding his people because of their idolatry and because of their embracing of these pagan or these false religions, and then allowing these other nations to simply follow their natural desires of conquest. And I think that's what we're seeing at the beginning of chapter 13. This is what the Lord is doing. He's removing his hand of protection from Judah and Jerusalem, and then allowing Babylon to come in and, as his instrument of judgment, deal with the people and their idolatry and their embracing of these pagan religions. Of course, then we see the judgments against Babylon begin because of their attack on Judah and Jerusalem. One of the things we need to always remember is God's promise to Abraham when he was telling Abraham he would become the father of a great nation, is that those who blessed Abraham, and by extension Abraham's descendants, would be blessed, and those who cursed Abraham, and by extension Abraham's descendants, would also be cursed. So those who would attack Israel, and I think that extends even to Israel today, ultimately will face God. One of the reasons, you go back, if you've ever looked at the situation coming into the establishment of the nation of Israel, and what the world situation was back in 1948, there's no possible way Israel should have survived. They were outgunned, they were outmanned. They didn't have enough rifles for every member of what was the Israeli army at the time, and it wasn't big. They didn't have enough rifles for every soldier to have his own rifle. They had no air force. They had virtually nothing, and yet they emerged victorious. The same thing in 1967, the same thing in 1972 or 73. God's hand, I believe, is still with Israel. Anyway, these judgments against Babylon, and what we talked about last week, is often we look at Babylon and we want to just see that city or that empire, or we want to look at Nebuchadnezzar and the other kings of Babylon. But when we talk about Babylon, we have to remember we're talking about several different things. Whenever you see Babylon referenced in the scriptures, there's a possibility that you're talking about the physical city. There's a possibility you're talking about the empire that was built by Nebuchadnezzar. But there's also the possibility you're talking about this center of pagan religion. Because from its very beginning, all the way back into Genesis, and there's strong evidence or strong belief that Babel, where the tower was built, the city of Nimrod, was the city that becomes Babylon. So it has been a center of these pagan religions almost from its beginning. So you can't look at Babylon and not include that as part of this. And then as we look at what John writes in the book of Revelation, we also see not only the spiritual side, these false religions standing in opposition to God, but that Babylon represents those people who stand in opposition to God. I think we're seeing all four of these as we're looking at these judgments. Interesting thing happens as we move into chapter 14. We see a very brief message of hope at the beginning of chapter 14. But then we see a shift of focus from Babylon itself to the king of Babylon. And one of the things we'll be looking at today is exactly who is this king of Babylon that Isaiah and the Lord through Isaiah is addressing. So Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 1. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Once again he will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. Foreigners will join them and unite with the descendants of Jacob. Nations will take them and bring them to their own place. And Israel will take possession of the nations and make them male and female servants in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. Anyone who believes that the children of Israel no longer hold a special place in God's heart needs to read these two verses. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob, a reference not just to a northern kingdom or a southern kingdom, but compassion on Jacob. Jacob, remember, was Israel. God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. So when we talk about the children of Israel, we're talking about the descendants of Jacob. Once again, he will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. Now, earlier in Isaiah, we see a reference that would seem to indicate settling the children of Israel back in their own land is talking about the whole tribal area that was divided under Joshua. And that includes all of what we see of modern Israel, plus this occupied West Bank that everybody thinks doesn't belong to Israel, plus the tribal lands on the eastern side of the Jordan River, Gad, Reuben, the half-tribe of Manasseh, which incorporate most of modern Jordan, part of Syria, and part of Iraq. I think we see that being alluded to, that this is eventually all going to be under the control of Israel. It may not happen until we actually move into what John describes in the book of Revelation, what we call the Great Tribulation. But I think that's eventually going to happen. And as I have said previously, I think we are seeing the beginnings of this prophecy today as Jewish people from all over the world are being drawn back to their homeland in Israel. Verse 2 shows us when this prophecy in these two verses will be nearing its completion. And that is when the Gentile nations, that's what it means. Nations will take them and bring them into their own place. Nations, the Gentile nations, will take them, the children of Israel, and bring them into their own place, the land of Israel, the land promised to Abraham. Verse 3, on the day the Lord gives you, again talking about the children of Israel, on the day the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil, and from the harsh labor forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. And this is where we see this shift in focus from Babylon itself now to this leader, this king of Babylon. On the day points to what we've seen referenced before on several occasions, this day of the Lord, or the end of days, this time when we are approaching the ultimate establishment of Messiah's kingdom, the restoration of David's throne and the reestablishment of the kingdom of Israel. And what happens when that day comes? The Lord will give his people, the children of Israel, relief from their suffering relief from their turmoil, and relief from the harsh labor they've been under. And when that happens, they will take up this taunt against this king of Babylon. This is continuing in verse 4. How the oppressor has come to an end, how his fury has ended. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, which in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows, and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. All the lands are at rest and at peace. They break into singing. Even the junipers and the cedars of Lebanon gloat over you and say, now that you have been laid low, no one comes to cut us down. Now, I don't believe the trees are actually talking here. I think this, metaphorically speaking, as I think we will see, this is metaphorically speaking in the spiritual realm. One of the problems I think we have is this idea of out of sight, out of mind. We don't see the spiritual world, therefore we don't often think about the spiritual world. But Paul in Ephesians talks about this, and I'll get to that in just a second. This, I believe, is pointing to this future time when the Messiah has come, when this Messianic kingdom is being established. This time that Isaiah spoke of back in chapter 2 when he said that the people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and when nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they study war anymore. This time he's also talked about when the prey and the predator will lie down together, the bear and the cow, the sheep and the lion. There will be peace on earth, but this peace on earth will only come under the firm hand of Messiah. The king of Babylon will be taunted by God's people because of his fall from power. And the nations the king of Babylon has subdued will rejoice in being released from his dominion. Verse 9, the realm of the dead is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you. All those who were leaders in the world, it makes them rise from their thrones. All those who were kings over the nations, they will all respond. They will say to you, you have also become weak as we are. You have become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you. Now, the realm of the dead is translated in other translations from the actual Hebrew word Sheol. And Sheol was, in the Hebrew culture, was thought to be this realm where the departed, or those who had died, would reside until the time of these final judgments against mankind. And we get a sense of what their idea of Sheol was in the story Jesus told about the rich man and Lazarus in the New Testament. And what he describes is this place where the dead reside. And he describes two halves, two parts of it. One part being, you could almost call it an Edenic-like paradise, and one part being a place of torment. And Jesus said that they're separated by a great chasm. And of course, he describes Lazarus as being on the paradise side, referred to, I believe, as Abraham's side or Abraham's bosom. And the rich man who had ignored Lazarus in this life is on the other side, in torment. And of course, he asks, could Lazarus at least dip his finger in a glass of water and touch it to his tongue? And that whole exchange. But this is kind of the realm that we're talking about here. And I think Isaiah is focusing in on this side we would call torment. And this is the place where this king of Babylon will go, and where he will be taunted by these other kings. And I would suspect that these are kings he has himself subdued, brought under his dominion and control. And you see what they say in their taunt: you have become weak as we are. You have become like us. And that brings us into verse 12. And this is one of the crucial pieces of this puzzle. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. What we are seeing here is the first clue as to the true identity of the king of Babylon being discussed here in this prophecy. Ezekiel describes a similar fate in his 28th chapter. And it is from Ezekiel 28 that we get the story or the understanding of the creation and fall of Satan. Jesus uses similar language to Isaiah. This is from Luke chapter 10, verse 18. Jesus said this, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Now, the word translated morning star in the Hebrew is Hallel, and it means light bringer or light bearer. And in Latin, it's the word Lucifer. Lucifer means light bringer or light bearer. And it's from this form in the Latin that we derive the name for Satan of Lucifer. Now, there are a lot who will say that Lucifer isn't Satan. Lucifer isn't the devil. Lucifer is just a light bringer. Well, I think it's pretty clear here in Isaiah, especially coupled with the description we see, the similarities in the description we see from this being's fall from heaven in Ezekiel, plus what Jesus said in Luke's gospel, that this morning star, this Lucifer, this son of the morning, could rightly be called Lucifer. And then there's Mount Zaphon. Mount Zaphon is interesting. I almost passed over it. And as I was reviewing this, I saw that in the verse. On the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. What is Mount Zaphon? You know, it sounds like maybe some kind of major religious site. I'm thinking, well, maybe it's just another name for Mount Zion. It isn't. Mount Zaphon, located north of Jerusalem, it was seen by the Canaanites in their religious observances. It was essentially their Mount Olympus. It's where all the gods of the Canaanites resided, including their chief god, Belshazzar, who is the equivalent of Zeus in the Greek pantheon, Jupiter in the Roman pantheon. He's their chief god. And this king of Babylon is making his throne above Mount Zaphon. In other words, he's controlling all these lesser gods that the Canaanites worshipped. We understand that Babylon was a physical city. We understand that Babylon was a physical empire. And like I said last week, it was also metaphorically a spiritual center and metaphorically representing those who stood in opposition to God. Just as the physical Babylon had a physical king, spiritual Babylon would have a spiritual king. We see this in part when we come into the 10th chapter of Daniel's book. Daniel had this terrifying vision, and it greatly troubled him. And he prayed to God for understanding of this vision. And we see in the 10th chapter of Daniel's book that from the time he prayed, it was 21 days before he got an answer. And the angel of the Lord that appears to Daniel with an explanation of this vision tells him that the day his prayer was heard, this angel was dispatched with the interpretation of this vision, but that the prince of Persia delayed him. And it wasn't until Michael, the archangel, the elder archangel for Israel, was dispatched to assist this first messenger of God, that he was able to escape the prince of Persia and come to Daniel. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not aware of a single human who could go one-on-one with an angel and hold it for more than a microsecond, if that long. So clearly this prince of Persia is talking about some spiritual being, a demon of spiritual presence that is behind the Persian Empire, that is behind the ruling powers of Persia. The Apostle Paul also talks about this in the 6th chapter of Ephesians. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. The king of Babylon in chapter 14 is being judged. And I think it's not so much the person, the physical king of Babylon, that's being judged as we move now further into this chapter, but it's that spiritual king of Babylon, that spiritual king of what Babylon represents. Who is the father of all these false religions and all these false beliefs and all of these anti-God, anti-Christian, anti-Jewish philosophies? But Satan. The spiritual king who embodies all of this and everyone who stands in opposition to God. Their father is that father of lies, Lucifer, Satan, or the devil. And with that in mind, listen closely to the rest of these judgments. But you were brought down to the realm of the dead, Sheol, the king of Babylon, this king of Babylon we're talking about. But you were brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you. They ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble? The man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home. Babylon was a mighty empire. It's thought by some that Babylon was probably the first truly great empire of antiquity. It even outshone the Assyrians that were also a great empire. But Babylon was subdued by the Medo-Persians. Persia was an even mightier empire than Babylon. And yet the Persians were subdued by the Greeks under Alexander. The Greeks even mightier than the Persians. And yet the Greeks were eventually subdued by the Romans. None of these approach the scope of the empire just described in verses 15 through 17. The ruler described in verses 16 and 17 specifically shook the earth, made the kingdoms of earth tremble, made the world a wilderness, overthrew the world's cities, and held the world's population captive. Are we talking physically, or are we talking metaphorically in the spiritual realm? I think it's the latter. This is a metaphoric reference to the power Satan has over those who stand in opposition to God. Who else but Satan could have done all that in the spiritual realm? Verse 18, all the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch, You are covered with the slain, with those pierced by the sword, those who descend to the stones of the pit like a corpse trampled underfoot. You will not join them in burial, for you have destroyed your land and killed your people. Let the offspring of the wicked never be mentioned again. And these are now some of the results of this king of Babylon's fall. Verse 18 describes the scene of a king or a national leader lying in state. One of the reasons that we see this happen is to honor this leader. I mean, a president of the United States or a former president dies, they're usually taken to the Capitol Rotunda and they lie in state for a period so that the people can reflect on their accomplishments, reflect on their legacy, reflect on who that person was. It is a way of honoring the memory of this individual who has died. And they are eventually placed in a tomb, and often that tomb becomes a place of honor. If you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, there's a huge site where John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline have been buried, an eternal flame. I mean, it's a significant, given the number of graves up there, it's a significant piece of real estate where this tribute to the late President Kennedy has been placed in Arlington. Verse 19 tells us that this king of Babylon is to be cast out of his tomb, is to be a corpse trampled underfoot. In other words, this king of Babylon will not be shown the respect due to a national leader, not be given the respect in death that he should be. Verse 20, you will not join them in burial. This reinforces the notion that this king of Babylon is being dishonored and even forgotten. Let the offspring of the wicked never be mentioned again. Then verse 21, prepare a place to slaughter his children for the sins of their ancestors. They are not to rise to inherit the land and cover the earth with their cities. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord Almighty. I will wipe out Babylon's name and survivors, her offspring and descendants, declares the Lord. One of the things almost every leader desires is a legacy. We sometimes joke about it. President so-and-so is doing such and such to make sure he has a legacy. Almost everything every world leader, every national leader desires is this legacy. They want to be remembered for something, and they want to be remembered for something good. Now, most succeed. Some have a legacy that isn't so positive. Take, for instance, President Harding. He did some very good things during his presidency, but what do we remember him for? The Teapot Dome scandal. That seems to have colored his entire presidency. This king of Babylon is to be denied even a negative legacy. There's to be no legacy for this king of Babylon. And that's essentially what these verses are saying. Slaughter his children, wipe out Babylon's name and survivors, her offspring and descendants. Then verse 23, I will turn her, Babylon, I will turn her into a place for owls and into swampland. I will sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty. And this essentially is what John describes happening to both spiritual Babylon, mystery Babylon, the whore of Babylon, if you will, and eventually the physical revived kingdom of Babylon that he describes in that book of Revelation. These will be destroyed, these will be brought down, and they will be utterly forgotten. And the reason being is that we're seeing here this ultimate victory of God and God's people over his enemies and all that these enemies of God represent in the person of this king of Babylon. Just got a couple more minutes here if you want me to try and finish, because we're right at 10:15. Next, we see a shift back to the judgment on Assyria. Verse 24, the Lord Almighty has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it will happen. I will crush the Assyrian in my land. On my mountains I will trample him down. His yoke will be taken from my people, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back? And again, this is reinforcing the judgments that have already been spoken against Assyria. Chapters 13 and 14 dealing with the judgments against Babylon. And I believe the reason we see this little snippet in here about Assyria, this little piece in here about Assyria, is because this is, as we often see in prophecy, a short-term prophecy being given that when it happens validates the long-term prophecy. If Assyria is judged and falls as God said it will happen, then what God has just pronounced against Babylon will happen. And that's what God basically says at the beginning of this, because he's swearing an oath by himself. And when God swears an oath by himself, he's essentially saying, I swear by myself, and by doing so he's saying, if this does not come to pass, then I am not God. And that brings us to the last passage in chapter 14. This is a prophecy against the Philistines. This is verse 28. This prophecy came in the year King Ahaz died. Do not rejoice, all you Philistines, that the rod that struck you is broken. From the root of that snake will spring a viper. Its fruit will be a darting, venomous serpent. The poorest of the poor will find pasture, and the needy will lie down in safety. But your root I will destroy by famine. It will slay your survivors. Wail, you gate, howl, you city, melt away, all you Philistines. A cloud of smoke comes from the north. There is not a straggler in its ranks. What answer shall be given to the envoys of that nation? The Lord has established Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge. The Philistines and Israel have a long history of hating each other. The Philistines were refugees from parts of Africa that came up around the Mediterranean, settled in what is now the area we call the Gaza Strip. And there's some thought that the word Palestine is derived from the word Philistine, so that the modern Palestinians have this connection, if you will, to the Philistines we see spoken of in the Bible. And of course, as Israel and the Philistines fought each other constantly, we're seeing that brought forward to the Israelis today and the Palestinians still fighting each other. This is most likely the one who, do not rejoice, you all you Philistines, that the rod that struck you is broken. This is probably a reference to one of the Assyrian kings who had come down and had subdued the Philistines. This king has died, and what this prophecy is saying is that this king has died. Don't rejoice in this, because there's another king behind him who's going to be even worse. You think you had it bad under this guy, wait and see what you have under this guy over here. It's saying that the poor and the needy are going to have an easier time of it than what this king is going to do to the Philistines when he marches against them. And this talk in verse 32, what answer shall be given by the king of Judah, is what's implied here to the envoys of that nation, the Philistines. It's thought this is a reference to this envoy to form a treaty against Assyria between the Philistines and the Israelites. And God says This is the answer you're to give him. The Lord has established Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge. In other words, don't ally with the Philistines. Trust God. God will preserve you. What I find interesting is there's relevancy I see in that last line. The Lord will establish Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge. I think there's relevancy in that today because that's part of what we're seeing happening in the Middle East right now. That the Jewish people are finding refuge on Mount Zion, of course, being where Jerusalem is located. The Palestinians want to put an end to Israel. This BDS, boycott, divest, sanction movement, which is gathering strength worldwide, is trying to put an end to Israel. They're trying to boycott, divest, or sanction Israel because of its treatment of the Palestinians. The thing is, if we go back to the beginning of chapter 14, one of the things we see is that it talks about the nations of the world gathering to bring the people of Israel, the Jews, back to their homeland. And I think what we're going to see, if this is truly leading into prophecies today, is that eventually this BDS movement will fail. Eventually, the Palestinian cause will shift in favor of Israel. Now, that still could be another 20, 30,000 years off. But I think that's what it's talking about. This is what is going to happen. The Lord has established Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge. Any questions? Isaiah chapter 15 next week. Thank you.